4 billion trees stood over these mountains. A man in New York noticed something wrong with one of them in the summer of 1904. I want you to sit with that number a minute. Not an orchard, not a stand of timber. 4 billion American chestnut trees from Maine clear down into Georgia, and thickest of all, right here along the Appalachian spine. One tree in every 4 you would pass in these woods was a chestnut, and inside of one man's lifetime, near about every last one of them was dead. This is the whole of that story, start to finish. How a single tree fed a family, fed the hogs, built the cabin, and bought the shoes. How a sickness came in on the wind and swept south 50 miles a year, and what the old folks kept after the trees were gone. Stay with me to the end, because the last thing I will tell you is the part most people never hear. That tree is not all the way gone, even now. You have to understand what these mountains looked like before, or none of the rest of it lands right. The American chestnut was the tree these ridges were built on. Down in the southern Appalachians, in a lot of the coves and slopes, 1 in every 4 big trees was a chestnut. They grew straight and they grew tall, 100 feet and better, with trunks so wide that 2 grown men could not reach around one holding hands. The old folks called them the redwoods of the East, and they were not far wrong. Now here is the thing about the chestnut that made it so dear. It bloomed late, come the end of June on into July, after the last frost had turned loose of the high ground. So it never got caught by a cold snap the way the oaks did, where an oak might give you 1 good mass year and then 3 lean ones behind it. The chestnut gave and gave and gave every single year, regular as the calendar. And when it bloomed, the whole mountain went white, long, creamy flowers all up in the crowns, so thick that from a distance in high summer, the ridges looked snow-capped in July. People who saw it never forgot it. My grandmother told me it looked like the mountains had gotten the seasons turned around. Come fall, that tree paid out. But nuts dropped in October, sweet and small, 3 to a burr, and the ground under a big chestnut would be shin deep in them. A family would go out with sacks and baskets and gather all the day long. Some they roasted, and some they dried and put up for the winter. Some went into the stuffing, come Thanksgiving, into the cornbread, into puddings, and a good many got hauled down to the railroad depot in the wagon and sold by the bushel for cash money. That was real money too, the kind that was hard to come by up in the hollows. Chestnuts went out on the train to the cities, up to Philadelphia and New York, to be sold hot on the street corners at Christmas. A mountain family could buy a year's worth of shoes and salt and coffee on the chestnut crop alone. And they did not gather all of them, not by a long way. What was left, the hogs got. Folks turned their hogs loose in the woods in the fall to fatten on the mast, and chestnut-fed pork was famous for being sweet. The turkeys fed on it, the deer, the squirrels, the black bear. That one tree ran the whole table, wild and tame both. Then there was the wood. Chestnut was light, and it was straight, and it split clean, and it had so much tannin in it that it just would not rot. A chestnut fence rail would lie in a wet field for 50 years and outlast the man who cut it. So they built everything out of it. The cabin logs, the barn, the shingles, the split rail worm fences that ran all over these hills, the kitchen table, the cradle, and at the end of it all, the coffin. The bark and the wood went off to the tanneries too, for the tannin that turned rawhide into leather. A man could be rocked in a chestnut cradle and buried in a chestnut box and never once leave the tree his whole life long. Now, the summer of 1904. There was a man named Herman Merkel, the chief forester at the New York Zoological Park, what folks today call the Bronx Zoo, and he was walking his grounds when he saw that the chestnut trees there had gone sick. The leaves up in the crowns had turned brown and dry in the middle of the growing season, which is all wrong. And down on the bark he found sunken places, cankers with little orange specks all through them. Those cankers were the killer. It was a fungus, a blight, and once it took hold in the bark, it grew in a ring clean around the trunk and choked the tree off from the inside, cut everything above it away from its water and its life. They called in a scientist from the New York Botanical Garden, a man named William Merle, and by 1906 he had named the thing that was doing it Where did it come from? It came in on chestnut trees brought over from Asia for planting in nurseries and yards. The Asian chestnuts had grown up alongside that fungus for thousands of years and learned to live with it. Our American chestnut had never once met it and had not a lick of defense in it. The scientists later gave the blight its Latin name, Cryphonectria parasitica, but a name was about all that anybody could do. Nobody on this earth knew how to stop it. And it did not stop. The blight traveled on the wind, on the birds, on the little feet of the squirrels, about 50 miles a year, and it moved in every direction, but mostly it came south down the spine of the mountains, straight for the heart of chestnut country. You could stand up on a ridge and watch it come year over year. First, the far ridge would go brown, then the near one, then your own hollow. There was nothing to be done, and Lord knows they tried. They cut fire lines through the dead trees, hoping to starve it out. The state of Pennsylvania spent a fortune trying to cut a clean barrier across the whole width of it. None of it held. The fungus jumped every line they ever drew. Now think on the arithmetic of it. A child born in these mountains in 1904, the very year Merkel found that first sick tree, that child grew up under chestnuts 100 feet tall, gathered the nuts every fall, slopped the hogs on the mast. And by the time that same soul was grown and married with children of their own, along about the 1940s, near about every mature chestnut from Maine to Georgia was dead. 3 to 4 billion trees, gone inside of 40 years, gone inside of one person's growing up. There has never been anything like it in this country, before nor since. For a long while after, these mountains were full of the dead. The chestnut did not fall over right away, you see. It stood there, gray and bare and silvered by the weather, whole hillsides of standing dead trees that the old folks called the ghost forest. You could pick them out from miles off. My grandfather's people said it was the saddest thing a body could look at, a mountain full of tall gray bones where the white bloom used to be. But that wood would not rot, remember. So even dead, the tree kept on giving. For 30 and 40 years, men went up and cut that standing dead chestnut and sawed it into lumber. By then, the beetles and worms had gotten into it and left their little tracks all through the grain, and they called that wormy chestnut, and it made the prettiest paneling and furniture you ever laid eyes on. There are old houses all through these hills, paneled in wormy chestnut to this very day, and every board of it came off a tree that was already dead before the man who built the house was born. And the people who had known the living tree, they got old, and they died too. That is the part that catches in my throat. There was a whole generation that could tell you the taste of a wild chestnut straight up off the ground, and the sound of the birds dropping in the dark of an October night. And one by one they went on, and they carried the memory of it out with them. My grandmother was near about the last one on our place who had gathered them as a girl. Now here is the thing I promised you back at the start, the thing most folks never hear. The American chestnut is not all the way gone. The blight kills the tree above the ground, but it does not always kill the root. And an old chestnut root, one that has been down in that ground 100 years and more, will still send up a sprout. All through these woods, if you know how to look, there are chestnut shoots coming up out of the old stumps, putting out those long, saw-toothed leaves, sometimes even flowering. They just do not get to grow up. The blight finds them while they are young and cuts them back down again, and the root sends up another, and another, hanging on, waiting. And they are not gone in memory either. Back in 1983, some folks who could not stand to let it go started the American Chestnut Foundation, and for 40 years now, they have been working at it, patient as anything, to raise up a chestnut that can stand against the blight and grow tall again. It is slow work. It may take longer than my life or yours, but every seed they put in the cold ground is a bet that these mountains can wear their white bloom in July once more someday. The old folks would have liked that. They never did believe the tree was truly finished. They only ever believed it was waiting. So that is the story, start to end. 4 billion trees, the tree that fed every family in these mountains, that built the cabin and bought the shoes and fattened the hog and got a man buried at the last. A sickness that one man in New York saw in one sick tree in 1904 that swept the whole of it away inside of a single lifetime, and a root deep in the dark ground that has not yet agreed to quit. If this story meant something to you, and if you had your own people who remembered these mountains the way they were, I would take it kindly if you would stay a while and hear the next one. There is a great deal the old folks knew that is worth the keeping, and I mean to keep telling it as long as you will sit with me. I'm Silas. Take care of your own.